Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be doing another iPad review today, and it's funny because I just dropped another iPad video before this, so it wasn't a review. It kind of was, but we're going to be looking at another iPad today, and it's the iPad 9.7 inch, and this is technically the 6th generation iPad in the lineup. And if you guys aren't familiar with these specific iPads, they're pretty much iPads that are the most budget-friendly iPads of the time. So these are kind of like the iPhone 11s and the iPhone XRs. These are pretty much those in iPad format for the iPad lineup, and these are the most budget ones you can pick up. They're right there probably with like the iPad minis and all that. Now what I would tell you though is that if you have all the money in the world, picking up the iPad Pro 4th gen would be amazing value. They offer a lot. Now I don't know a lot of places you can still pick this specific iPad up. They replaced these with the 7th gens last year, so these technically are the 2018 models that came out in March, and these are actually about 2 years old at this point, which is really cool. And since this thing has been released, there's been a ton of different developments with the iPad lineup. We've pretty much removed the bezels on the iPads. They're almost bezel-less for the most part, and they look very, very good. So let's see how this iPad still holds up in 2020. So looking on the front, we do have that 9.7 inch panel. It is a Retina panel, which is really cool, and it's an IPS screen. Now the resolution is 1536 by 2048, and that's a pretty big, good looking panel for the most part. However, there is a little bit of gap between the glass and the screen itself, I believe. So this one does have that. It's not that big of a deal. I still think the panel looks really, really good. And it's a very good panel for anything you're really going to throw at it, which is really, really nice. You have a little bit of bezel around the display, which isn't that big of a deal, I'm sure. You have that front camera, which is really cool. You can take FaceTime calls and all of that. On the bottom, you have that Touch ID sensor, which, like I said, in this day and age might look a little dated, but we still have iPads like the iPad Mini 5 and the iPad Air 3 that still retain the home button and are still being sold brand new by Apple, so I don't really think it's too outdated. And plus, they just came out with the iPhone SE 2020, and that still has a home button, so trust me, home buttons are still here for a little while. I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. On the bottom, we do have that lightning port, which is cool. We have a headphone jack on this iPad as well. I'm going to keep saying phone, I feel like. And on the back, we have that single camera setup. And for sure, at the end of the day, in the hand, this iPad still feels very, very good. It doesn't feel cheap or anything like that. And it's right up there with, like the iPad Mini 5s and the iPad Air 3s and the iPad Pro 10.5 inches. It doesn't feel like a cheap device at all. It still feels very, very good. What I would tell you, though, is that, some people might not like the design, especially when you compare it to the iPad Pro 3rd gen and 4th gen. Some people like that, low bezel design, but you can still kind of have a mixture, I believe. If you don't want this specific iPad, you can always go for the 10.5 inch, which is also very, very good. It has very slim bezels on the sides. It, looks just kind of like the iPad Air 3. And I would recommend a lot of people to look at those ones if you're interested in maintaining a slimmer profile, but still getting a cheap iPad. That's also a pretty good value. And I'll leave that one link down below from Amazon if you want to pick it up from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that really pretty much covers it up on the outside. It doesn't feel like a cheap iPad at all, for sure. So in terms of the exterior, but there's no IP certification or anything, so I don't think really any iPad has that yet, but that would be really, really cool. If you spill some water on it, you're probably going to, get it damaged here and there. Another quick thing, this thing does support the Apple Pencil, which is really awesome, but it only supports the first Apple Pencil, so you're going to have to plug it in through the lightning port at the bottom, which I don't understand what's going on there. I don't know why they chose to do it that way. Trust me, I'm right there with you. But this thing does support the Apple Pencil, which is really awesome at the end of the day. So that pretty much covers it up on the outside. Now hitting on the software, this thing was released with iOS 11.3, so probably on the tier end of iOS 11, which really wasn't their best version of software. However, we are able to get iPadOS 13.4 on it, which is really cool. And right now there's 13.4.1, I believe, and iPadOS has been a very, very welcoming change to the iPad lineup. This thing really took iPads from being, kind of, average for the most part, their software being just a bigger version of, iOS, for it now being its almost own separate OS. It is its own separate OS, and it does a pretty good job of handling, even though it's kind of, the same thing as iOS in a lot of ways. It still handles a lot of things, and it's cool having its own separate iPadOS and having its own separate software, which is really cool. So I think iPadOS is really, really nice, and there's a ton of new features. Even with 13.4, there's been a ton of new features added. We have the new mouse support and the new mouse gestures, which is really cool. So I think at the end of the day, it's a really awesome thing, and this thing's going to be getting support for a very long time. This thing has the same exact chipset as the iPhone 7, but as we've seen before, and you guys, this might be a conspiracy theory, but we've seen a lot of iPads that have had the same chipset as iPhones, but those iPads end up getting more software support than those iPhones. So I think that's pretty cool. There's potential room for the iPad mid 6th gen to continue on further past the iPhone 7's death rate, past the iPhone 7's timeline, but we're going to have to wait and see what happens there. So in terms of the software, that pretty much covers it. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this iPad had the Apple A10 Fusion chip, a quad-core CPU, and there were two different models, the base model with 32 gigabytes of storage with 2 gigs of RAM, and the top tier 128 gig model with 2 gigabytes of RAM as well. What I can tell you about the performance of this iPad is that it's not a bad performing iPad as a lot of you guys could expect, and I think it's just a little bit faster than an iPhone 7, which sounds kind of funny. With iPadOS 13, there's really nothing that's like crazy with it. There's not a lot of background process, same thing with iOS, but I feel like at the end of the day it feels a little bit smoother. But here's the little thing, but they're both very good smooth devices at the end of the day. But with the iPad 6th generation, whatever I really did with it, if I'm going to go and multitask, if I'm going to go from one app to the other, if I'm going to go ahead load up picture-in-picture and go watch some other things and go on Twitter or whatever, this iPad handles those things, which is really, really cool. And I love seeing that when you have an iPad or you have any device of that matter that still handles things like that perfectly fine is really, really cool. And this iPad isn't that old, you know what I mean? It came out in 2018, so performance for the most part is going to be really good. And I can see this, and I think Apple kind of targeted this for students overall. If you're going to college or whatever, if you don't want to go and buy a MacBook or a laptop or whatever, an iPad is a very good replacement. And I 100% agree with that. When you have this iPad that has Apple Pencil support, I think a lot of people are going to be using this for, student like tasks, like taking notes and writing papers and writing documents and things. And for those things, for sure, this iPad will handle those things perfectly fine. You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to do those things, it's going to be perfectly fine. Maybe the only thing that might not run well on this iPad is like heavy intensive gaming, but even then it can run those games perfectly fine. It's just, there might be some glitch frames here and there, but overall the iPad will feel like a perfectly fine device in terms of the performance at the end of the day. But again, I wouldn't just necessarily pick up this iPad for getting the best performance, but if you're somebody who's, meeting iPad, and if you're wanting to get an iPad based off, student like tasks, like I said earlier, like taking notes or writing papers or whatever, then you're probably going to have a very, very good time with this iPad. It's not going to, cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It's probably going to cost you like $200 to $300 to pick up, which is still hundreds and hundreds, but it's not like 500, 600, maybe even 1,000 if you're going to go pick up a MacBook. This is a pretty decent MacBook replacement for a lot of students out there. Even though I would still probably recommend getting a MacBook if you're a student, this iPad I think is perfectly fine for a majority of people out there for sure. So I definitely think in terms of the performance, the iPad 6th generation is perfectly fine for a majority of people out there. Now hitting on the camera, this thing has a single 8 megapixel camera on the back and a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front, and that back camera is kind of just like the iPhone 6 camera, but without the capability of shooting 1080p at 60. This thing tops out at 1080p at 30, which is still perfectly fine for a majority of people. I think this iPad is really good for mainly everything you're going to throw at it. I think there are some cases where maybe your FaceTime calls are a little glitchy, maybe they're not going to look as good, but it really doesn't matter. You're really going to be using this iPad for FaceTiming. I don't think anybody's really going to be using this iPad for taking actual videos and photos and things like that at the end of the day. So for sure, I think iPads are awesome, and I think they deserve the camera qualities that they have, but I don't think anybody's going to be using this thing to replace their cameras anytime soon. So for sure, this thing has a pretty good camera, but it's still nothing to go and replace your current iPhone camera with. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 8,827 milliamp hour battery, which is a very good battery life and battery size for this specific device. You have a screen that's not crazy resolution. I mean, it kind of is, but it's nothing like too insane. It's not overly powerful. It's not anything like that. So in terms of the battery, this thing will be perfectly fine for, like I said, a majority of people that are going to be using it, and it's going to be more than perfectly fine. You're going to be able to get multiple days of use out of this. And if you're just using it seldomly here and there, the standby time on this iPad is very good. Even if you want to charge that Apple Pencil while you're, standbying on this thing, it's still going to be perfectly fine. You're going to have a very good time with it for sure at the end of the day. So I think to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you still pick up the iPad 6th generation in 2020? And what I will tell you is that without a doubt, 100% yes. If you're somebody who wants to, if you don't know whether you want the iPad or not, or you want to test the waters or something, this iPad is a tremendous iPad to pick up. It still has, almost, it still has a pretty good chipset inside of it. It has a pretty good battery life. It has a tremendous screen for the most part. Apple Pencil support first gen on that. And I think there's really not too many ways to look, bad at this iPad. It's not supposed to be replacing your iPad Pro or anything, but I think for the most part, it's a pretty good tablet. And for what it brings, I have a lot of respect for it at the end of the day. So, but like I said, if you have a little bit more money, maybe an iPad Pro 10.5 inch might be the way to go. Like I said, you can pick one of these up for about $200 to $300. You can pick up an iPad Pro 10.5 inch from about $300 to $400, somewhere in that range. So again, I would probably recommend going that route, but this one is still a tremendous iPad 2 at the end of the day. So that is pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, leave it down in the comment section below. Like I said, I will try to link those iPads that I find earlier and link them down below, including the 10.5 inch. If you guys want to pick those up, you can. Hit the like button if you guys enjoyed the video. I think I already said this, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel. All those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys would check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.